Hi, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Jennifer,
And I'm Ashlee.
and I get to introduce our guest today. And as always, we have a special guest. And I was reflecting, I'm like, I actually think I've known this guest since I've been born, and I'm not related to them. So it's the first time for that. But we have Dr. Charles Baker with us today. And I'm just going to give it to you, Dr. Baker, to tell us a little bit about yourself.
First of all, thanks for having me, and hope I can add something to your podcast here from my background and experiences. Well, I'm originally from Louisville, Kentucky. Grew up here, went to high school here, and began college here. I went to Western Kentucky University for a year right out of high school, and that's a little bit relevant to my first real job was on the Louisville Police Department. Today, it's the Louisville Metro Police Department. Back in the day, it was the city of Louisville. I began my work there on January 8th of 1973.
Okay.
After having 1 year of college at Western Kentucky. I went to Western out of high school with the goal of being a high school teacher and a coach. But a good friend of my father's was a Louisville police officer, and they were in a hiring spree at that time, and he encouraged me. So I went down, took the test, and before I knew it, I was in recruit school in January of 70. And that was not my plan. But once I got there, I really super enjoyed it and began my career there. We can get into that later, and a lot of it's relevant to what I do today. But I had a lot of assignments during my time there. Enjoyed every bit of it. So anyway, I got sidetracked for several years with the Louisville Police. And like I said, I had 1 year of college there. While I was on the department, the training officers that I had at that time encouraged me to continue to go to college. And we had a federal grant, the LEAP money that came out of the late 60s, federal grant to pay for college. So I enrolled at the University of Louisville part-time while I was working. And it was those original trainers that I had that encouraged me to do that. And I'm always grateful for the department for allowing me to do that and actually paying for it. It was a challenge to go full-time, to work full-time and go to get your degree. But I ended up with my master's degree because of the police. But I did 20 years there, worked in a variety of assignments. But I retired when I had my 20 years in. And I didn't leave because I disliked the job. I really enjoyed it. But I was young enough to do something else in life and allowed me to go back and do what I originally wanted to do, to be a high school coach. During that career time, I also went back to school to get my high school teaching certification. So when I retired from the police department, I could teach social studies in high school, Kentucky certification. And I got a job teaching at actually the high school that I attended here, Coy High School. I taught for 2 years there, and then I went to a law enforcement magnet at another school. And I was in my third year teaching, and my wife worked for an airline, and she got transferred to Phoenix, Arizona. So at that time, I was very emotional about this, but I had to quit my job and go out there. And so I only did 3 years of what I really wanted to do originally right out of high school. But I had a good time doing that. Went to Arizona, and my first job out there was director of security for the Mesa, Arizona Public. So I became chief of security for them. That was my job when we left to move out there, and did that for 7 years. My boss, an assistant superintendent, and he hooked me up with a professor at Arizona State University who talked me into earning my doctorate at Arizona State. So moved to Arizona. Instead of watching TV at night, I'd go to college and finished my doctorate. And my dissertation tied in law enforcement as well as education. And back then, this was Columbine High School day.
Yeah.
And so my dissertation was about the attitudes of school principals in reporting crime from school.
Oh, wow.
Was that relevant at that time? 20 some years later, it might be worthy of a follow up with that to see if it's changed. But anyway, finished my doctorate. I had the opportunity to become a professor at Scottsdale Community College. And so I finished my time. I did about 7 years at Mesa Schools and 12 years teaching college. Got to retire, and we moved back home. And since then, I've been here teaching as an adjunct at the university. So that's the Cliff Notes version. So
Now that is incredible. And now I want to go read your dissertation.
Well, It might be boring. So
No, no, not at all. I feel all of that. So I'm excited to have you on here to talk about that. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is amazing.
Well, and I don't know that I knew that your story was so full circle in terms of going to a teacher's college at Western University and that always being a bit of your calling. And so it makes sense that you kind of merge these two worlds together. And do you find that your experience on the Louisville Police Department influences how you profess or your teaching of the criminal justice?
when I started teaching criminal justice at the community college level, a lot of entry level courses,
Mhm.
survey courses of the criminal justice system, not just policing and those, but looking at policing, the courts, and corrections. The three legs on the stool generally of policing. So I try to incorporate all those in, but basically with the police being the catalyst for all of those. Without police investigating crimes, making arrests, we don't go to the court system. We don't go to the correctional system. And so I try to incorporate all of those in there. But it's been helpful, especially again, these survey courses that introduce you to constitutional law and those kind of things. I try to gear it toward how that impacts the people that work in the freedom of speech, to protest and those kind of things, and what police officers need to know about balancing a community's right to express their views publicly, but yet not cross the line and interrupt with civil order and civil disobedience. How to balance those kind of things out. The search and seizure, the right to remain silent, all those things. How the police officer on the street has to understand those and know the limits of their authority and those kind of things. So I've tried to incorporate the practicality of that with sort of the words, textbook words, the academic words, and I think students have generally appreciated that. So
Yeah, and that was kind of our next question, or one that I had, was how your students kind of respond. Do you give your own real world examples of what it was like for you when you were an officer, and how do they respond to that?
well, up front, I tell them a lot of times, and this gets a little bit, I don't know how to say it, maybe touchy right now, because I've always tried to play devil's advocate
Mhm.
and come up with scenarios during the classroom of practical situations that may occur on the street. And I would tell them up front, these are not always my views. I'm just playing devil's advocate to encourage discussion, to encourage you to come forward and share your thoughts. And so, I might say something that's not what I truly believe, but just to foster some discussion in the classroom. And I would bring up scenarios, and I would tell them they're not all mine. They might be some of my colleagues that have been involved. Again, in this day and time, I think we have to be cautious about that, because I could come up with a devil's advocate sort of scenario and someone think that's the way I truly feel, especially when it comes to race relations. When we talk about Floyd, we talk about Breonna Taylor and all those kind of cases, it can become emotional, and you just have to be cautious about how you phrase things so that they don't think that that's the way you truly mean. But we have to. I really believe this in academia. We got to discuss the truthful things that go on in our society, even if they're unpleasant or maybe hurtful.
No.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point in trying to walk that line of giving real life experiences and not having it kind of be viewed as your own perspective. From your perspective, what do you feel like are some maybe misconceptions or things that get brought up in the classroom that are kind of misconceptions around criminal justice or
Well,
weapons?
I think one of that strikes me, and it's interesting. Having done this for a long time, I do things. I do some online classes too, so I have a lot of what I call critical thinking questions. There's no right or wrong answers, but their responses are. If we were in the classroom, it would be class participation. Raise your hand and speak up. Online, it's writing your responses. I found out that they will post online more, I don't know, truthfulness or their feelings more than they will verbally in a classroom with other people where someone could look at them. I'm finding that out. I can see how attitudes have changed among students in a lot of areas over the course of the years. One example of that is I would ask them that if someone died of a drug overdose and the person that sold them those drugs illegally, that killed them, do they have some level of responsibility? The person that sold them.
Mhm.
Years ago, it would be no, 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 no. The person that bought the drugs and took the drugs, it's their responsibility. I've seen that evolve over the years where now they're willing to hold the person that sold them the illegal drugs more culpable. And I'm not saying them all. I'm just saying statistically, I'm seeing more that agree with that than did several years ago. But I think what misconceptions, obviously, one that's been for a long time is police drive fast and they shoot guns and they do this, the TV type stuff. And I would tell them many of your hours a day are boring driving around patrolling and writing reports. And this is one thing that I have emphasized, particularly when I worked at community college out in Arizona, because we worked closely with the local police departments around there, and they would tell us that the shortcomings they're seeing in their recruits are the ability to write, the ability to document what they did. What they did may have been correct, the investigation, but it becomes lacking because they don't know how to articulate it in writing. So when you emphasize writing, that's not the fun stuff, okay? No. But I tell them how critical and important that is. So that's the fallacies of that, and the perception because of media, I believe, with high-profile cases of George Floyd and horrible cases of things. They see bad things that police do sometimes, and then they sort of lump it all into one pile. They stereotype a lot for that, and I have to emphasize to them that the vast majority of police officers just want to go out and do a good job and want to go home to their families at the end of the day, and they're not out to racially profile, or are there exceptions to that, like any other. So some of them that I've misconceptions.
Yeah, and I love to hear this. I also think like we actually have a lot of listeners who aren't even in the first responder world, which is really cool. And I think for those listeners too, this is such a great opportunity to learn that these things are being talked about. Because I think it's easy for a lot of people who are not in the first responder world to feel like it isn't considered, these things aren't talked about. We turn our heads to it, right? Like that's what I hear a lot. And I know that that's not true from working in it so much, but to hear it from you and to hear how, well, first off, you articulate it amazing. And so to hear that and to learn from you, I think is going to be really helpful to our listeners because you're right. We have to talk about it.
You can't just bury your head in the sand and they'll all go away. So I think that's important at the college level or other levels too, even at the high school level sometimes. I did a couple of law enforcement criminal justice type classes in high school. And I thought they were valuable, particularly young people at that time, to be aware of what the reality of policing was that they faced. When they see a police officer on the street, they see it hopefully totally different when discussed it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And how do you, I know you kind of hit on this a little bit, but maybe you can dive in a little bit more of like, how do you balance your own knowledge with the academic part, like especially if it kind of goes against what you have thought, within your career and how things have evolved so much. Like I guess your personal self, how do you manage that when
we're that's a really good question. A couple of years ago here at the university, they have the Southern Police Institute. Jennifer probably aware. And they had an opportunity for me to go teach that class. And I went through that program in 1982. So that shows you how old it is. And so I welcomed the opportunity to go teach. And that had law enforcement commanders from all over the country in this class. And this here are probably more than in the undergraduate or graduate classes I teach. They would bring up their real world experiences and contrast it with the academic peer-reviewed research, so to speak. And so the one to try to summarize that feeling a little bit, and the way I've tried to do it is certainly you have to welcome the research, especially good peer-reviewed research, statistical data. Today, I'm hearing questions about Washington D.C. whether they had accurate criminals or crime statistics. Have they been fudged and all that? And so, but one of the things when you look at the academic world of these theories and strategies, the thing that I kept emphasizing to them from my standpoint is, you can have all that academic information, but in the real world, you have to consider people's feelings out on the street, the community's feelings, how they feel about things may contrast significantly from what the data said. And so that's one thing that I've always loved about when I worked on the police department. I had a lot of good jobs and I moved up the ranks to some extent, but the most rewarding job I ever had was writing a beat. Jennifer knows, in South Louisville, where I grew up and went to school, and where you get to know people on the street. And if you got a second, I've got one example of that I think indicates it. My best friend growing up lived down the street from me, and his mom turned 90 years old. I went to visit her. She still lived in the same house. She could live at home. She thought someone was breaking in her house one night. She called the police, and they told her that you don't need to worry. This is a relatively safe neighborhood. Well, I know the neighborhood has changed a lot since when I grew up.
Right.
And I saw her, and she told me that she didn't have to worry. That didn't make her feel good because she was still scared. And I said, we have to incorporate balance people's feelings and their perception with statistical data or peer reviewed research. I think you have to mesh the two together. So that's what I've tried to do, and to say, okay, yeah, this is valuable, but also you have to consider this. What does the public really feel? And so I think police officers on the street need to. I wish they would still have those connections on the beat. I don't know that they do, but hopefully.
Yeah.
As a therapist, I love you using the word feelings.
Yep.
Because obviously, those are really important. And I think that that's such a great example. And, I have a great belief that human beings are herd animals, and we are here to connect with other human beings. And to your point, how first responders serve a community is important, that it's connected with that. So I think that that is a great example of that. Since we're on the kind of lines of feelings, I want to talk a little bit more about officers and their feelings, and just what conversations you've seen around mental health, the evolution of that from your career starting in 1973 to, being a criminal justice professor. Have you seen that shift over time or anything like that?
I haven't actually been on a police department for several years, but I'm aware of some of the changes and evolving, I think, of that particular area. I go back to my early days, and maybe even through most of the career, to identify an officer as having some sort of emotional feelings or troubled feelings. Ever since I went on, the couple of things: alcoholism, suicides, and that, relatively speaking, in this profession are higher than many other professions. And they've always said, well, it's the availability of your weapons and all those kinds. The one thing that I hope is getting better, and I believe it is to recognize that officers all perceive things differently. Something might impact someone very emotionally in one thing, and someone else it not really bother them, or they handle it different. I think anyone that has a pulse or a human, when you see tragedies happen, or if you're involved in a tragedy, or you see a family that's torn apart by some violent crime, I always said you're not a human if you don't feel some level of emotion. But the question is, how do you separate that from doing your job? I've worked with officers, and including me, where we kind of identified the truly innocent victim as one that hurts. And I think many times we differentiate that from someone that put themselves in a bad position. But I do feel like, at least publicly, departments say that we recognize this. I can't answer whether they do it practically. I mean, we hear about it. Is it lip service? I don't know the answer, whether it is or not. I hope it isn't, but I think it's always been difficult for coworkers and first line supervisors, because at least when I was on the department, it's close knit. If you became a supervisor, you're supervising people that were your friends for a long time.
Right.
And I really think it's difficult for any of us to see a colleague or friend that may be going through some troubled times to report that, because you don't want to make a wrong judgment, and you also don't want to jeopardize their career.
Oh, right.
By saying something that you're maybe not qualified to say, but it's just based on what you see. So there's got to be a mechanism to do that you maintain confidentiality and not, quote unquote, ruin someone's career because you made a comment about it. Yeah. So I do feel that there are some mechanisms, and hopefully departments are looking at that. And it's, if you come forward yourself, if you self-report, that your career is not over because you you can't handle this or something. And police officers are, I don't know, probably I never thought I was this way that much, but the tough facade that you can handle any kind of situation. There's a human side to all of this, and people need to remember that cops are humans before they were cops. So.
That is super powerful to hear you say. And I think human beings are complicated. And to your point, individualized. And what might bother somebody is water off a duck's back to somebody else, and something else could bother that for another person, water off a duck's back to them. So I think that's an incredible point to say that there are individuals that are human beings that do this job, and the impact of that.
And I hope it always remains human beings do it. It doesn't become artificial intelligence tell us
Well,
what we're
oh
doing.
gosh.
Well, I do want to ask you as a professor about AI and your students, but that's a different episode and another question.
But when I graduated from recruit school, the person that gave our speech he was a state police commander. Back in '73, we had a computer room that had less data on it than our cell phone. It's huge, and computers were beginning to have an impact. And he said this. He said, "We will always have police officers. Your job will always be safe, no matter what happens with computers, because we always have to have the human element dealing with human tragedy or human conflict." I hope he was right. I get a little bit concerned about that today, but I hope he was correct.
So true. I have to go back to this whole I always say that in my trainings at the police departments. I always say you are a human before you're an officer. So again, to hear you say that was incredible. And for our listeners to continue to hear that, I think it's just so important. I have a question a little bit in regards to, and I'm going a little off the beaten path, but just in terms of like mental health, is that talked about for first responders in the academic setting?
I can't say that directly.
Okay.
There are, at least in the classes that I've taught, the survey classes. I've done the police in Arizona. I had a class called the police function, correctional function, and in those classes, you talk about there's sections of that deal with those particular issues for people that work in those professions. The stress of those kinds. If I go back to my undergraduate days, there was a book that came out then called Society's Victim, the Police. It's a real thin book, but it was one that we read, and I wrote my graduate paper on stress. That goes back a long time ago about we have stressors that everyone has, financial, emotional stressors, but it went into the specifics of stressors in law enforcement, and there's a whole laundry list. But I think, at least from my experience, and I can't speak to all the criminal justice programs around, but it would be incorporated in parts of those classes that talk specifically about law enforcement or specifically about correctional law, those kind of things. So we would go into it. I wouldn't say it would be in depth, but we did touch on it.
And I'm totally calling us social workers out, and I'm letting it out here. I used to teach at the college level as well. And something that I feel super passionate about is in the social work world, we have all these specialties. So geriatric social work, right? Medical social work, school social work, and so forth. But there was not one thing that I ever learned about social work in terms of helping our first responders. So I'm super passionate about that because I think that is something we need to start pushing in colleges as well, right? Like you guys are also a special population that needs to be acknowledged too. And so that's why I kind of brought that up to see on that end. I don't know as much about the criminal justice, part of it. And so I just know on our end, I think that can be something that's enhanced upon a little bit more.
Well, and I appreciate, criminal justice is a broader, it's not just, and yeah, I think that I've worked with people in the criminal justice realm, like attorneys, things like that, judges that have seen horrific cases. They're not the first responder to that, but those experiences can be really impactful. And actually, I've been approached by attorney's office here to talk a little bit about mental health and wellness for lawyers, in terms of those heavier cases. And so I think it's good that there's conversations, because you're exactly right, Dr. Baker. Criminal justice is not just law enforcement, it's a whole system. And so I guess I'll try to, ask this question in that broad system of criminal justice. But is there ever the topic of discussion, mental health and the impact of working in a system that you see, unfortunately, society's kind of worst things? Obviously, mental health, but also like the impact of a family. Are there any conversation? And I know that's maybe a very detailed question, but just really have a lot of curiosity.
Relative to family, is that what you're saying?
Yes,
Relative, yeah. I think again, going back to, I don't, when I've been teaching the classes, I don't say, okay, let's talk about how this impacts a family, but I have incorporated it like streaming it through the class.
Hmm.
One of the things that just from a basic standpoint, people say, oh, I'd like to be a police officer. Okay, fine. Just remember, you're going to work weekends. You're going to work nights for a long time. They will say something like, I really don't want to be a patrol officer, but I'd like to be a narcotics detective. Or I said, you just don't start out there. You have to pay your dues. And sometimes you pay your dues for the entire career because you don't get the opportunity to work in CSI that they think on, every case is going to be solved by DNA. And so I go back and I said, part of the uniqueness of the job that could lead to stressful family situations is the fact that you're working weekends when all of your friends are going to the movies or going to a concert, and you have to say, I got to go to work. You have to work at nights, especially, and I can say this, I had two daughters, and I worked, out of my 20-year career, I would bet 2/3 of it was working at night, 3 to 11 shift or midnight to 8. And when you had the two daughters, growing up with gymnastics, with t-ball, all these kind of my oldest daughter was in dance. She was always at these dance recitals that would last for 6 hours. I'd get out of it because I had to work. but you miss some things. You miss, and you think, well, that's no big deal. But then when I look back on it and say, man, I wish I could have gone some of it. But it's a trade-off. Now, I have to say, and I can't speak to that today, but when I was with my police department, you couldn't do it all the time. But if you had something special that you wanted to go to, you could trade off days around, or somebody would cover for you and you'd trade. But I do think that has an impact on families because inevitably when something goes wrong in the house, it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you're at work. And that puts a strain on the marriage, that you have to have it's kind of a teamwork thing, have to work together. And those are things that are, again, you go back to the unique stressors of this job. And I think for me, one thing was, and it's a good thing that you love your job so much that you want to go to work. I worry sometimes that becomes, I like to go to work as opposed to my family. I like it so much.
I love this.
You think, yeah, you love it, but you need to get your priorities kind of straight too. So I think that's a challenge for that. So I think those are unique stressors. Now there's other occupations that work, nurses, doctors, work at night,
Yes.
So you have to have a spouse, a husband or wife, because there's a lot of women in law enforcement that work nights. It's probably more difficult for them, especially if they have children. At least what our society says they should be. That's evolving. I think that's evolving. Sometimes, and this was me having two daughters, so I'm empathetic. So, that I understand their unique place in society with their job and trying to raise children. So I do think that, I do incorporate I build it in across the class. We have these 2 days on stress and family. I just kind of say, I kind of weave it in there.
That's so, and I love that it's even been talked about. And I think that you hit on it. We talk about this a lot on the podcast, actually, is some of our first responders in the clinical work that we do, they use work as the escape from home. Like things maybe aren't going great at home. And so I can go to work and work overtime and do all these things, but then you are missing out on the family aspect of it.
When you mentioned overtime, and I go back a long time ago, and I am eternally grateful for the opportunities that I had. And I think made a good living, didn't get rich, but there was a time when you're young and you got a young family and you want to buy something new, and the opportunity to work off-duty jobs is everywhere, or to work overtime. You start doing that because, okay, you rationalize it. I'm making money so I can get my family these better things, but what are you sacrificing to get it? And I think that's reflecting back on that sometimes even for myself. I think, was it really worth it? But you don't think about that for that immediate gratification right there. So
I think to know it's a through line and like a thread that you weave throughout is really impressive. And I just am glad that it's there. I think Ashley and I kind of created this podcast because we had concerns that there are families that are, and not intentionally, I don't think it's an
Right.
intentional thing. Like we just don't want to be with our family. Sometimes people don't want to be with their families. But is there something within like academia where there could be opportunities for more research about families of people that enter the criminal justice?
Well, I'm sure there are, and again, I don't know everything that's out there when it comes to that, but certainly I think it'd be worthy of research about just what we just spoke about was do officers love their job so much that it replaces their family sometimes. It's a close knit, at least in my experience as law enforcement, close knit. Those people you worked with were who you hung with when you were off duty too. You
Yeah.
went to golf with, you went Jennifer knows you go jogging, you go running, when
You play softball, yeah, all
play
the things.
softball and all those kind of things, you did it with those same people. And the other thing too, going back years ago when it looks at I wouldn't call it, I don't know if it'd be a stressor, but something that becomes part of your fabric is that if you go somewhere socially with a group that's not police officers, right off the bat, you get identified as the cop in the room. And now I always, and I'm sincere about this, even when I was young, I didn't want to be identified as a person because of my profession, but I think we all are to
Yeah.
some extent. He's a doctor, he's a lawyer, he's a cop. And then if you're in a room with people that may not appreciate cops, you get the evil eye sometimes. So you got to, you try to tell, well, I'm not like what you think we are, those kind of things, those kind of, that's an issue. So I think that's where it becomes cops tend to hang out with cops and makes their families hang out with cops too, instead of socializing to the broader area. I'm not saying that's all the time, but I think that's kind of common.
Yeah, I agree. And some of that is your point, just that natural thing that happens around shifts and schedules and things like that, which makes sense. But to your point, like it's sometimes that work of broadening, right? That you are more than just this one thing. There's different aspects of you.
And it's good to not to see the world from a cop's point of view. Yeah, we need to
Yes.
see it from the way others perceive it. Also, we may not agree with it,
Yeah.
but it's important. I think when a police officer is riding a beat in a social economic area that they didn't live in,
Mhm.
I think it's incumbent upon them to try to understand the social economic status and
Yes.
way of life of the people they're serving, not patrolling, but serving. I've always been against the term police force.
Mm.
I call it police department or whatever. The force implies that's all we do. So that's just me though. So
I know our listeners cannot see us right now, but Jennifer and I are smiling from ear to ear because that was so powerful
Yeah.
and so true. And everybody does need
I never thought of it as powerful, but it's just kind of my personal
Yes.
feel. So
it really is. And for the sake, Jennifer, I hope you're okay with us moving to the next few questions here, just because of the sake of time. And we're kind of talking about these things already. One thing we know is like training and policies and all these everything that's kind of coming into play today, right? In your view, what is the most critical change needed, maybe in like law enforcement training today?
that's needed today.
Yeah.
The human interaction,
Yes.
communication,
I would.
communication with your audience, with the people you're serving. And again, I think sometimes people attracted to police work are not always familiar with or understand the community they're assigned to serve.
Mhm.
They come from a social economic background that they have their views of the world, their worldview, and then they're patrolling an area that doesn't have that same worldview. And again, you don't have to agree with it, but
Right.
but I I probably can't emphasize this enough that I worry to this is my kids call it okay boomer, baby boomer, back in my day kind of thing. But and I try to technology it's a wonderful. I mean, officers are writing reports on a laptop and I had to write it on a piece of paper and go to a telephone and call it in, and that's time consuming. And so technology is great. but we communicate. Like I said, my students communicate more online than they will in person, face to face. And you know as well as I do, you can say something, you can text something to someone, and they perceive it totally different than what you, because they're not watching your body language, they're not looking at your inflection, and so you got to be careful. That's you husband and wife talking. That's not what I meant when I texted you that. And
Right.
so I written communication. When written, I mean even if you do it on a laptop or type it, to be able to articulate an investigation in a chronological way that when you turn that report in and it goes to a prosecutor who wasn't there, there's a picture of what you did and you did it correctly. But also dealing with people on the street, human interaction. I don't think that's ever going to go away. Cops have to respond to domestic violence or people arguing and fighting over something, and you have to intervene. And you've got to be able to quell situations and diffuse situations, not throw gasoline on the fire.
Right.
And I think that's, I guess they say they do that, but that ought to be ongoing and not just, okay, let's have a week of how we do of communication. Let's do it all the time.
Yeah, I love that. I'm like so excited that you're talking about this because when I wrote my dissertation, I wasn't expecting that to be a huge part of it, to be honest. But almost every police officer that I interviewed brought up in terms of recruitment and the new generation coming on board to these departments, just the lack of the communication skills and how they are concerned about it.
And understand body language and inflections and all that. You can say something that appeases someone or it infuriates them. It just depends on how you, not just what you say, but how you say it.
Yeah.
Well, and I so appreciate just the humanitarian aspect of this in terms of like, again, you are connected to other humans and in service to them and their community and the compassion of that. And I think that's something like kind of what you started with in terms of like misconceptions and things like that. I won't speak for Ashley, but I know the people that I serve are incredibly compassionate, are here to help. Sometimes is because of an experience that they weren't helped when they were younger, and they want to make sure that, that doesn't happen to somebody. And so I think it's powerful to say, like, these are actually things that are happening behind a uniform. And also that those are things that are important when you are in your uniform, human interaction, and how that can either de-escalate something or escalate something.
I was so fortunate when I first came on the department, and I think I mentioned to Jennifer about an article I read the other day about them lowering the educational standards. But when I went on in '73, my training officers were all mostly high school graduates from the '50s and '60s. But at that time, that was a pretty good education in those days. Today, there's a lot of high school graduates that are not very academically sound. And I don't mean that meanly, but that's just the case. These guys, the people I rode with, were so street smart. They were smart. They knew how to deal with people. And the ones that I'm not saying they were all that way. I was just very, very lucky to get training officers that showed me that and instilled that. Said, let's don't make this situation worse. Let's calm it down. And we've seen examples on the news a lot of officers that take a bad situation and throw gasoline on it and make it worse. And I was lucky to have people school me in that, I guess, back in the.
Well, was there anything in terms of after leaving policing and receiving your doctorate that made sense in the rearview mirror about policing that maybe you didn't quite, when you're in it, that when you step back and that academic role had a different perspective for you?
I look back on my time there, and this goes back. I'm driving down a street yesterday, and I remember the very first call I ever got on the police department, and it was 53 years ago. That's half a century. That's over half a century. And so, but I do remember things vividly of my very first call, and then some others. And when I reflect back on that today, the police department was really good for me personally because I'd probably get antsy and had the ability to go and work in different areas.
Mm-hmm.
I worked in different patrol areas in our community. I worked in the crimes against children unit. I worked in the intelligence unit. I worked several years in homicide. I was a commander in the homicide. And I loved that because it was like getting a new job, but I didn't have to start all over. I'm still getting the paycheck. You know how sometimes you quit a job because you want to try something new. I could do it right there and the paycheck would be the same. And that was good for my personality. If anything, I don't regret it, but I do think about it sometimes that I didn't go into an area to become more competent, to be more specialized. Like some people never wanted to move up the ranks. They wanted to stay in homicide for all those years and they became an expert. And, you know, I became a sergeant, went to homicide and had never worked there. But I had good people that knew what they were doing. I learned from them. And so you kind of, you know, it was always my goal to move up in the ranks. I did to some extent, not as far as I wanted to, but hindsight's 2020. I'm good. Okay. so, you know, I was kind of a generalist. I'd call it a generalist type path.
Yeah.
As opposed to becoming quote unquote an expert in a certain area. So
Well,
I don't know that I would change, but I do think about that sometimes.
I was just saying, I think that's how Darwin says we survive, right? You got to be flexible and moving. So you just made sure you had survival.
I like change. I like different. Just me personally, and you know, when I reflect back, there's things that we did then we could do better. Police departments, we evolved. You know, I tell you how I related. I started in 1973, and I was really young. It wasn't 5 years earlier. We were having racial turmoil in the streets in my neighborhood where I grew up. You know, I remember being in junior high school in 1968 when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and outside my school window, someone hung Martin Luther King in effigy. And I looked out the window, and I'm like, even my parents thought this was horrible. And so we had turmoil in the streets of Louisville, Kentucky, and I'm patrolling those beats 5 years later, and I'm thinking, you know, we can do it better. But we learned lessons from that. It's troubling today when I see bad things happen around the country that, well, not everyone learned the lesson, you know.
I agree with that. And you know, you say, oh, back in the day, and really in reflection.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Baker. I want to obviously respect your time. I know we had like 1,000,001 questions.
We did have a lot of questions.
We didn't overwhelm you with that. We knew we wouldn't hit them all, but there's so many good ones, and I feel like we really could keep going. But I appreciate your time, and I honestly loved learning from you. So I hope that we continue to do that.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and you know, at this point in my career and life, I like to share my thoughts, and they're not always correct, but I always like to promote the discussion. And I appreciate your time.
Well, we really appreciate your time. And as much as, you know, I appreciate you saying, well, that's maybe outside of my expertise, I do think that you provide a lot and have a lot more expertise. So we really, again, appreciate your time.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ashlee, what do you got for us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just so excited for our listeners to hear this and always to remember that when the call hits home, Jennifer and I are here for you. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.